Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to today's lecture. Uh, with me always, of course, is Oyster. He doesn't have much to say, but he adds a lot to the lectures for sure. He has a lot to everything. Anyway, I hope everyone's doing well. And today we're going to be talking about the Civil War and its prospects. And it would be easy to assume, of course, that the Confederacy was doomed to failure. That seems obvious, right? There's no way that the Confederacy could have won the war because of its disadvantages in the areas of manpower and industrial might. And there is some truth to that. I'm going to share screen. I forgot to do that earlier. Sorry. I wanted to have it up. There we go. What we're stressing today is that either side could have won this war. And I want us to take some time. We'll carefully analyze some of the strengths and weaknesses of each side. So we want to make the point about the experiences of the American Revolution when the much weaker colonies defeated the much larger, much more powerful Great Britain. This war, the Revolutionary War, reminded those on both sides that the greater power does not always triumph. And for today's lecture, we will discuss the early strategic planning on both sides before moving on to some of the crucial battles in the first years fighting. And we'll want to trace the progress by which the conflict burgeoned from a fairly limited military contests at the time of First Bull Run in July of 61 into this massive bloody struggle by the time of Shiloh and the 7 Days War battle at the end of 62. And the United States and the Confederacy each had strengths and weaknesses. Also, I want to point out that throughout today's lecture, I will somewhat interchangeably go between the South and the Confederacy. They're not really the same thing. I want to point that out. Confederacy represented the South, but many residents of the South did not support the Confederacy. Confederacy, Confederates represent a distinctive subset of people in the South. So, in the northern U.S., well, a lot of relative advantages. First glance, let's see, what would they be? We hear in the South, especially, that the South had no chance to win because of advantages of size, and that was just a matter of time before the North would overwhelm the South. This is an instance here. We're going to look backwards, though, to understand what could have happened. We'll try to read forward, though, here, because no one knew exactly what was going to happen when the war started. And we need to try to understand the circumstances as they unfold rather than from the 21st century where we are now. So we'll look at some weaks and strengths. So first, population. Yeah, huge advantage for the United States. Approximately 31 million Americans in 1860, and 22 million of those lived in the Union. There were approximately 5.5 white Southerners and 3.5 to 4 million enslaved and free people of color in the South. So taking these elements into account, the North had a 5-2 advantage in military age manpower. So 2.5 to 1, if you break that down a little more. Economically, the North had an edge, definitely. There was approximately 110,000 manufacturing establishments in the Union and approximately 18,000 in the Confederacy. That's huge. Also, there was about 22,000 miles of railroads in the North and about 9,000 in the South. And railroads were much more modern in the North. The North had twice as many draft animals, which means horses, mules, oxen, etc. And these animals are needed to pull armies, because remember, this is a 19th century army. The Army and the Navy in the Union. The United States began the war with a professional Army and Navy, although they were small. It was about 15,000 enlisted men in the Army, several dozen vessels in the Navy. Nonetheless, they are intact. They exist. The Confederacy did not have an army. Also, let's think about leadership. It's hard to define exactly how political leadership constitutes an advantage, but it does. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, proved to be a strong enough leader, but Lincoln was by far his superior. Piloting the United States through the crisis required extraordinary political talent, and Lincoln took it. The Confederacy also had strengths. So the conditions for victory. This might be the most important part of the whole thing, because the Confederacy didn't really have to win, it just had to tie. That's all he had to do. Didn't have to invade and to conquer the Union, or the United States, whatever you want to think of it. It just had to persuade the United States that if it didn't have, it had to convince the United States that they could not defeat the Confederacy, and that it was not worth their trouble. And it was just not worth the cost either, both of human lives and economically speaking. And clearly, the Confederacy has the home field advantage. They're fighting on their ground. They know the terrain better. They would have a clearer sense of motive. They're defending their homeland from an invading army. It would be a friendly population around them. The geography also favors the Confederacy because it is an enormous space, about 750,000 square miles, 35,000 miles of coastline. It does not have a good transportation infrastructure, as we were talking earlier, 9,000 miles of railroads. So that means that the Union Army is going to have to move itself very slow. Daunting challenges for the U.S. to defeat the Confederacy. There's certain factors that favored neither side as well, and they were about equal in certain spots. Military leadership. And you often hear it said, especially here in the South, that the Confederacy enjoyed a true advantage here. And in the early stages of the war, absolutely, but as time went on, it evened out more and more. And there's a pair of spectacular generals in the South, Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. And on the U.S. side, by the end of the war, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman had proven themselves up to the equal to Lee and Jackson. They are able to go toe-to-toe with them. Now, in the sense that the United States had more incompetent leaders than the CSA, but this too was perhaps overblown. Both sides had plenty. Overall, it's basically balanced out over the course of the war, with one small difference being that the Confederacy had never found a second capable army commander to go along with Lee after the death of Stonewall Jackson. It's important to keep in mind that almost all the officers that held high command were, on both sides, were trained at West Point. They took the same classes with the same professors. They read the same books. Many of them fought together in the Mexican War under Winfield Scott and under Zachary Taylor. They applied the same ideas on battlefields. Both sides believed it was a mistake to launch frontal assaults. Flanking attacks were better. They shared a number of similar military articles of faith. These are not different peoples with dramatically different strategies. Okay, and the other question here is Europe. What would Europe do? This was a very big question and could change the tide of the war right away. The two greatest European powers, Britain and France, are key here. Would one or the other decide to intervene? And after all, France had come over and intervened during the American Revolution. And both sides were very aware of how important French aid was during this war. They remembered this. Both were acutely aware of the fact that the weaker power had won the revolution. And overall, the U.S. entered the war with considerable advantages, but also so too did the Confederacy. By no means a hopeless attempt. It's not a lost cause. And in the end, it would come down to the question of which side would stick to it the longest, who would just ride it out. This was one democracy against one quasi-democracy at war. And what the people wanted mattered a lot. Another key are border states. Both sides focus a lot of energy on the border states. What would they do? Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They all have different populations, different things to offer, different resources. So Kentucky, very important. It had the Ohio River and its northern border. And if Kentucky was in the Confederacy, it would potentially control the American access, the U.S. access to the West. Kentucky was probably the most divided of the border states. It is the birthplace of both Lincoln and Davis, though neither grew up there. It had ties to both North and South. Kentucky did stay with the Union, but Lincoln kept troops out of Kentucky because he did not want to provoke it in any way, just to leave it alone. And many Kentuckians went and fought for the Confederacy, but more fought for the Union. This is a case of brother versus brother. 3 of Henry Clay's grandsons fought for the U.S., and 4 fought for the Confederacy. Guerrilla warfare was rampant throughout Kentucky. Now, Missouri, as we've spoken of, kind of already had its own little civil wars during the Kansas turmoils of the 1850s. Many of the border ruffians, of course, had gone into Kansas to fight anti-slavery settlers there. And as the war broke out in 61, there was sort of a mini civil war going on already. But by the end of 61, the Unionists won out. A divided Missouri declined to secede, but also, like Kentucky, there was guerrilla warfare throughout. A very contentious, nasty, ugly place. It sent about 3 times as many soldiers to the north as it did the south. Maryland and Delaware, Maryland, somewhat Delaware, posed a special problem for Lincoln. If Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would more or less be in the Confederacy at this point, geographically speaking. This is something that Lincoln, of course, would not stand for. Unlike Kentucky, Lincoln took direct action in Maryland. He had pro-Southern sympathizers arrested, including members of the legislature there. He prevented anti-Union men from voting, and he worked to ensure Unionist victory in the elections of the fall of 1861. And by the end of 61, Maryland, like Missouri and Kentucky, remained in the Union, sent about 20,000 people into the Confederacy, and about 40,000 went and fought for the Union. There was no significant guerrilla warfare like in Kentucky and in Missouri. Delaware is small, not quite as important. Leaders in Delaware did not consider secession very seriously. And some did fight. Some people did go and fight for the Confederacy, about 1,000 versus about 11,000 for the Union. And finally, there is West Virginia, the new state, a 5th border state that was created over the course of the war. It was carved out of the original state of Virginia. And it was people in West Virginia were long at odds with people in the eastern part of the state. It was an area of few enslaved people, Economically and culturally, it was more similar and more tied to Ohio and to Pennsylvania. And West Virginia broke away from Virginia in the spring of 61. 50 counties in all left. A number would not have voted to go, but were forced to go by Unionists backed by the military, and officially came into the Union in 1863. People went to both sides of the armies there. People went to both armies to go fight. By the end of 61, none of the border states had seceded and gone with the Confederacy. This is telling here. They still remain slave states, though. And this is a factor that made Lincoln proceed very cautiously, slowly regarding emancipation. He wanted to maintain the loyalty of these slave states. He was afraid that if he alienated slaveholding interests, they might join the Confederacy. Legitimate fear. The absence from the Confederacy of these states, the absence of these states from the Confederacy cost them a great deal. Now, strategies. Strategic planning in the Battle of the First Bull Run dominated the initial year of the war. Both sides made moves to protect their capitals after Virginia seceded. Each looked on to how to best conduct their military operations. Richmond and Washington are only 100 miles apart, which is very significant here. It means that the strip, this 100-mile strip, is going to be intensely contested over the course of the war. It was much thought about, it was much fought over, and the two sides pursued very different national strategies. The Confederacy pursued mainly a defensive strategy. It only had to counteract what the United States did. Remember, if the U.S. didn't invade, it could win. So it sought to defend its borders, knowing that a tie was as good as victory. The United States, of course, needed to strike at the Confederacy and needed to bring Virginia down, Richmond down. The main Union planner early on was Winfield Scott. He was the hero of the Mexican War that we spoke of a little bit earlier. He was the general-in-chief of the U.S. armies, one of the great soldiers in U.S. history. By this time, though, he was about 75 years old. He was enormous, as you can see. He weighed about 350 pounds. He was not in good shape at all. He wasn't going to go fight. But, I mean, he had lived a very good life, and he was paying for it with his health. But he had a very active mind, and he applied that mind to defeating the Confederacy. So he came up with a long-term plan. It's called the Anaconda Plan. You can see this right here. Push down the Mississippi River with joint army and naval forces, take control of the river, cut the Confederacy in two, blockade the southern coastline from European goods during the course of the war, and if necessary, strike into the inland parts of the Confederacy with an army. And all this, by Scott's estimate, would take about 2 to 3 years and about 300,000 soldiers. And he was thinking of a much larger conflict than many people were anticipating. And in the end, he was more or less right. His plan was how the U.S. would defeat the Confederacy. It just took a little bit longer than Scott had even planned. And from Lincoln's perspective, the worst part of this plan was that it would take so long. He was under pressure from DC to make something happen immediately. So the drumbeat in the North was calling for an immediate victory with one decisive battle. And Lincoln succumbed to these ideas, this pressure early on. He became preoccupied with it even. Result was the battle of First Manassas, or the Battle of Bull Run. And they're all the same battle. Many Civil War battles have two names. The Confederacy tended to name battles after towns in geographical places. So Manassas was a railroad junction there. The U.S. tended to name battles after territorial territorial features in the area. So Bull Run was a creek, or is a creek. So the first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, whatever you want to call it, July 21st, 1861. It gave the Confederacy an initial victory early on. The U.S. commander at Bull Run was General Irvin McDowell, and he was instructed to move against the Confederates who were congregating at Manassas Junction, about 25 miles outside of D.C. McDowell had 35,000 men. His opponent, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, whom we've already spoken of New Orleans, had about 20,000 men, and there were reinforcements close at hand. When the two armies fought on July 21st of 61, the Union was winning the battle throughout the first phase until a group of Confederates under Stonewall Jackson made a stand on a small hill. And this is where Jackson got his nickname of Stonewall, because his soldiers were inspired at him standing there like a stone wall. And this helped turn the tide towards the Southern advantage. And Confederate counterattacks swept the U.S. forces from the field. When they retreated, the Union retreated back towards Washington. And a lot of people, a lot of civilians had come to watch the battle. They brought picnics with them. They thought this was going to be just some skirmish to watch. They came mostly from D.C., and when the U.S. forces began to give away and retreat back to Washington, it was just pandemonium. There were stampedes. Civilians were getting caught up in all of this, having to run back towards the safety of D.C. It was a chaotic scene on all the roads back to D.C. Soldiers, civilians, their carriages that they brought, cannons, moving on this just wave. The Confederates, though, were almost just as disorganized because they all of a sudden had won. They didn't follow up with their win. They had just won the war's first big battle. Many people in the Confederacy were inspired by this victory, and it seemed to affirm the sense that they could win the entire war. Gloom was the situation in the North, though. Most people had not expected the battle to go like this. They assumed that their superior forces would easily decimate the Confederacy. But now it's looking like this war could go longer than expected. Also, casualties at this battle made people realize it would be a bloody war in addition to just being a long war. And there was more of an uneasy, quiet period for several months following Bull Run. Nothing was really going on. The U.S. commenced a series of offensive in the first half of 62, though. And these major offenses met with mixed successes. After a period of, again, not too much fighting, the U.S. put into operation plans to strike towards Richmond in the Eastern Theater and to secure as much territory in the West as possible. And U.S. forces did gain upper hand in the Western Theater under General Henry Halleck. He put together an offensive move that carried out part of that Anaconda plan we spoke of a minute ago. And he wanted to make sure that he could secure the Mississippi River and deep into the heartland of the Confederacy and into Tennessee, even along with the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. The U.S. put Grant in charge of the Tennessee portion of this campaign, and Grant was a West Pointer who had mixed to not good successes in his life outside of the military, but he would, by the end of the war, prove to be, after Abraham Lincoln, the second most important figure on the Union side. And in February and March of 62, Grant captured two forts, Forts Henry and Fort Donelson, which opened up key river routes, opened up the way to the fall of Nashville, and this allowed for a slow movement down the Mississippi River. Grant, here we go, is a map, made it to the Mississippi, but he ran into a large Confederate army planning a major counteroffensive. And the two forces clashed near the Tennessee and Mississippi border there it is, in this backward place called Shiloh, or some Pittsburgh Landing. It was an enormous battle fought on April the 6th and 7th of 1862. The battle went back and forth, Confederates having the advantage, Union having the advantage. Ultimately, Grant's army did defeat the Confederacy, but it was unbelievable losses. There were 11,000 Confederate casualties, 13,000 U.S. casualties. These 2 days at Shiloh, more Americans were shot than all other American wars put together at that point. This blew people's mind. They cannot believe the casualty lists that are coming out. It's just bad news is coming out. It won't stop. It gets even worse because around this time in 62 is when New Orleans falls to the Confederates, to the Union, sorry. So if we look at this map here, though, we're seeing a string of Union victories all throughout. But it wasn't going as well for the U.S. in the East. Confederates had stopped U.S. forces there. Union offenses against Richmond continually failed. They could not get there. The principal commander was George McClellan, who at this time was 34 years old. He was very ambitious. He was very smart. He was certain that he could win this war. He despised Lincoln. And he decided to strike Richmond by moving a large army by water to the area of Norfolk, and then moving overland against the Confederate capital. He almost got to Richmond by early June, but a large series of battles at the end of June thwarted his offense. Yeah, you can see there, McClellan. So Lee's victory in the 7 Days campaign in June and July, it was June 25th through July 1st of 1862, turned back McClellan's offense towards Richmond. There was even more casualties at this 7-day war battle, than at Shiloh. Lee followed up his success at Richmond with a second victory, the second battle of Bull Run or Manassas in August of 62. Here, Lee and Stonewall Jackson rather easily defeated the Union troops. It was, again, another bloody battle, though. 25,000 more casualties, 16 on the U.S., 9,000 on the Confederate side. The U.S. Army did retreat back to Washington. U.S. command was more or less in chaos. This was an astonishing turnaround from the earlier victories from June. U.S. success in the West was staggering. U.S. Army was within 5 miles of the Confederate capital, but by the end of the summer, the U.S. in the East had been roundly beaten, and now the Confederate Army is just about 20 miles outside of the capital, outside of D.C. I thought I had another slide here. I didn't. But Northern morale is dipping. Lincoln, always at odds with McClellan, turned back to McClellan to help end this war. And McClellan's organizing skills were good, but his leadership skills in battle just were not. And there, because I think I'll we'll pick up a little bit later on. Sleep.